to say. I think Sloane's going to say a few words.
Sure. I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight. And we're really proud to have this screening and this dialogue about speech. And it's interesting that, these past few evenings, Stephen has been mentioning being in this police state and the crackdowns that have been happening on speech. And I was thinking today about how what happened first was actually a protest against corporate values and greed and really this desire to come together and talk about how things could be better or different or other than how they are. And yet now, with the shift that's happened this week, it just seems to be so much more about whether or not we can have that conversation rather than the content of that conversation. I hope that we can have a rich discourse tonight on freedom of speech, especially in one of the trickiest, most sensitive, and most delicate areas of that, of the very concept of free speech. And we were really excited when Sarah Schulman proposed putting this together. And the potential for dialogue here is really important to us. In addition to creating a safe space, a safe planet, we have this sci-fi theme, and this is kind of like our time capsule night. Tonight we start out in 1997, and then we're going to travel back further to see some vintage porn from Bob Mizer. And then finally we have the classic Flaming Ears, a great lesbian sci-fi flick that I'm super excited to just watch tonight.
On 16 millimeter.
On 16 millimeter. Wow. And did someone clap? That was great. The idea being that there's so much to see and so much dialogue to engage in here tonight, and we really appreciate you being here. Be sure to check out our lounge. Be sure to check out our installations. There's also an ongoing, in our orbit, there's an exploratorium over on First where you can stop for tea and cookies and see installations every night before our screenings.
And that's running until December
3rd. There will be events and performances going on even beyond the Mixed Festival. These are artists in our orbit that we're proud to support.
At the La Mama Galleria.
Yes, at the La Mama Galleria. Thank you.
6 East First Street between Bowery and 2nd.
Which I just refer to as right on the block.
But we're going to run the film now, and then we'll be back. Sarah and the distinguished panel will be back to talk about it afterwards. So we will see you all then. Thank you so much.
An Individual Desire Solution by Lawrence Brose. So Larry has been part of this festival for 24 years, for the entire length of the festival. And Mix is really the long-standing advocacy organization for queer avant-garde artists. And so it was appropriate that we have a discussion about his case here. A case that many people have fled from, have abandoned him, and have shunned him, and that's not what we're about. And our purpose is to discuss everything, no matter how complex or difficult. So that's why we're here today. We have two guests. We have Keith Merrick from the Lawrence Brose Defense Fund. We have Judith Levine, who is the author of Harmful to Minors, from the National Center for Reason and Justice. Now, I'm just going to read two prepared statements, and then I'm going to say a few words, and then we'll go to our panelists. In September 2008, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents operating under Homeland Security visited Lawrence Brose at his office at SEPA Gallery in Buffalo. They informed him that the IP internet address at the shared artisan residency loft at SEPA showed up on a German website that had been taken down because of the presence of child pornography. The agents claimed that 58 images from that site had been downloaded via that IP address, and he didn't have access to the loft and Lawrence's computer because the IP address was registered under Lawrence's name. When the agents discovered that the computer was a Mac, they said that they had to take it to their lab for inspection. 14 months later, they brought charges against Lawrence for possession of suspected child pornography. They've also included 100 images of his exhibition prints from De Profundis, the film you just saw, in the charges. If convicted, it would mean a lengthy prison sentence and labeling Lawrence as a sex offender for life. Lawrence maintains his innocence throughout this ordeal. And I also just want to tell you what the Center for Reason and Justice. The National Center for Reason and Justice is a nonprofit organization that supports people who are falsely accused or convicted of crimes against children. It also works for child protective laws based on science, fairness, and good sense. The National Center for Reason and Justice has recently established a permanent artist fund to help falsely accused artists. This also provides opportunities to expand our outreach to artists to educate them about laws that threaten freedom of expression, especially when the content includes sexual imagery and images of children. This case raises many, many complex questions which we may not be able to resolve tonight, but we certainly can think about. Issues of forensics and computers, viruses, technical issues, and then the larger big questions about why the FBI is pursuing these cases. Then the questions about what do we feel about looking at images. Child pornography are the only images you're not allowed to look at. There is no motive that makes it legal to look at child pornography. Murder is illegal, but you may watch a film of someone being murdered, but you cannot look at images of child pornography. Do we feel that if someone does look at those images, they should be subjected to jail time and lifelong sex offender status? These are a lot of complex questions. So now we're going to start with Keith, who will give us some update about the case, and then we'll go to Judith, and then we'll go to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Is this working? Yeah. Okay. I've known Lawrence since I was 12 years old, and the thing that I like to tell people about Lawrence is that he turned Secret Gallery from a very grassroots, kind of a neighborhood photography center into something that's really on the international map. He has been very successful in bringing foundation and government funding to Buffalo, to Secret Gallery. And one of his strengths is that he has supported the individual artist. He's been a champion of bringing money for other artists. I think that's really important for people to know about him. Where do I want to go with this? Okay, the update on the case is his lawyers are very expensive, and they are working on his behalf, in his interests. They want to get him off. They may not be fighting the issues, like to the extent that we want to change bad laws, but they want him to be innocent of these charges, which he claims he is innocent of. It's really important to remember. So what they're doing at the moment, and it's going to be like in 3 weeks in Buffalo, they are going back to court. Both sides have been able to explore their evidence. Lawrence's lawyers are going back and saying his rights were violated in coming up with these accusations. They're not necessarily addressing the laws and the reasons for these bad laws to exist. They're trying to prove his innocence in whatever means they have. I think that's important to know. There are other important people around who want to fight the injustice of these laws. Lawrence's lawyers are not hired to do that. They are hired to defend him. So they're going back to court. There are 16 points that they're using to claim that his First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendment rights, and I can't tell you what those all are in any real detail, but the way that they took his computer, illegal search and seizure. Thank you.
Fifth is testifying against yourself.
Exactly. So they came to his studio really like unannounced, and Lawrence was like, "Sure, I'm an open book. I'd love to tell you about my work." And then they said, "Well, we'd like to look at your computer," and they wanted to see his studio. Now, it's also important to remember that this IP address that they're using to claim these charges against him is an IP address in a studio nearby where he works. The gallery is in downtown Buffalo. 4 blocks away is a big loft space that he used to live in. He rented it on his own. Subsequently, he moved into a house with his lover. He gave the loft over to see the gallery as a visiting artist space. He left the IP address available. So this IP address that's being used to build the case against him was in a space where many people had access to it. And you may look back and say, gee, that wasn't very smart. but that's a fact. The agents who came to visit him at first, Lawrence reminds us constantly, is that they told him they were coming to him because they knew he was a queer artist. This is also something that I think is important to note. He feels targeted because he's a queer artist, an unknown queer artist. And while it's true that this film is not being suppressed, the images are being used to build the case. It's more character assassination. 100 images from this film. A film is made of still images. Lawrence took a lot of these really beautiful images and printed them up and put them on the walls of some pretty august institutions like the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo. And this film has been shown all over the world. The film is not being suppressed. This is not a censorship case. This is about being accused of downloading and possessing child pornography. I want to make that point real clear.
I thought I would tell you a little bit about how child pornography law got to be here and how Lawrence is in this situation to begin with. I was just looking at a film that was made in 1965 by Charles Keating. You may remember him as the SNL swindler who went to jail, but before that he had another life, which was that he was the founder of Citizens for Decency. He was an anti-porn crusader from 1957 up through the 70s. And he made a film called Perversion for Profit, in which, like all anti-porn crusaders, he went meticulously and obsessively through every single piece of pornography he could find, showing the images with little things across the eyes. And among the kinds of pornography that he shows in this film are images of what would now be called twink, young kids, but many of whom are younger even than 18 and look young. And it struck me that in the 60s there was a sort of bigger variety of porn than there is now, strangely. Anyway, I think that's on too. Fast forward to 1976. 1976 was the Democratic convention in New York City, and to clean up Times Square for the convention, the New York City Vice Squad went out to find every kind of porn that they could get rid of, and one of the things they looked for was child pornography. And they found really very little of it. Nevertheless, this little tiny bit of black and white over and over mimeoed pages became the basis of what I think is a kind of spectral enemy. Child pornography, as one would really, what really is child pornography, and those are images of prepubescent children engaged in sex acts, sometimes with adults. And I'm not even talking about, being just masturbating, being naked. I mean, actual sex, kids having sex, is a very minuscule, always has been a kind of boutique, small corner of the pornography business, and it's not a business anymore at all. Anyway, so 1976, a crusade began. Two people, one is named Judy Ann Denzinger, who was the founder of Odyssey House. Do you remember that? Odyssey House was a kids rehab place in Times Square, which was later shut down because Judy Ann Denzinger, who was embezzling money from it and using humiliating tactics with the kids. And an LAPD vice cop named Lloyd Martin went traveling throughout the country saying that child pornography was a scourge, that it was there were 1.2 million children who were being exploited by it. They apparently made this up. They got it, they had quadrupled it from some guy who had just thrown out this number, who was an author. But nevertheless, even though they made everything up, Lloyd Martin told the Congress that sexual exploitation of children was worse than homicide. By 1977, the first child pornography law was passed, criminalizing the creation and distribution of sexual images of children under the age of 16. By 1984, the law had raised that age to 18. By 1993, images in which kids were neither naked nor doing anything sexual were criminalized. By 1996, the subject of the so-called child pornography didn't even have to be a live person, live child. It could be someone who was intended to look like a child. There used to be a sort of trope in child porn where you'd have an Asian woman wearing saddle shoes and knee socks to look young. And in fact, that image could even be a computer-generated image, and it was still child pornography. The sentences for child pornography over the years have grown and grown and grown. They have not ceased to grow. Since 1996 or so, they've tripled. Now, the minimum you get is about 10 years, and because they enhance the sentences, for instance, a video is considered 75 images. That's one of the reasons that Lawrence was charged with so many images. If you use a computer for the crime, which everyone uses now, if it is a crime, that enhances it too. So the upshot of that is that everybody gets the maximum. But Lawrence is not being targeted because he's a queer artist, I hate to say. This is a law that criminalizes any image of a child that could remotely be considered erotic. And that means even the naked image of a child. Indeed, many artists have been arrested or repressed because of images that they made. Jock Sturgis, David Hamilton, Jenny Livingston, the films Lolita, Happiness, Günter Grass's Tin Drum. I mean, many pieces of literature and especially images have been criminalized, made by artists. But this is a law that strikes everybody, anybody and everybody. You do not have to intend to download child pornographic images. We don't know what child pornographic images are because, as Sarah said, no one, no journalist, no social scientist, not even in some cases the attorneys for the people, can look at the images. Many of them, I believe, are probably pictures of teenagers, like the ones I think that Lawrence has been charged with. And so every kind of person, especially there's a lot of young kids, teenagers who look at pictures, who get sent to prison for 10, 15 years and are sex offenders the rest of their lives. And so what I think is happening to Lawrence is not because he's an artist, but in spite of the fact that he's an artist. That is to say that the net is so wide that it can take in anybody, including you. If you download pornography, child pornography can be catched by your browser. There are some forensic experts who say that probably everyone who goes online, which is everyone in this room and probably 3/4 of the people in the world, probably have child pornography on their hard drive. And once you are accused, your life is over. I think this has to do with a kind of literalization of fantasy, number one, a denial of the sexuality of children, a prohibition of any fantasy about children, and finally, the police state that has existed since 9/11. It used to just be the postal inspector's office that would deal with this stuff. Now there's Homeland Security, Department of Justice, ICE, the immigration, and all of the international law enforcement agencies as well. So there's really kind of a worldwide surveillance of many, many, many millions and probably billions of dollars. So all I would ask you is that in supporting Lawrence, if you do, and I hope you will, that you understand that he is part of a vast number of people who have been put in prison for doing pretty much nothing. There are 750,000 people on sex offender registries in this country. many of them for consensual sex with minors, even when they themselves were minors. There are millions of people in jail on sex offenses. Most of them, I think, are consensual sex. So the laws are terrible. Lawrence is a guy who fell into a very, very broad net, and we can talk later about, more about what that net means culturally, but be against the laws don't just help him.
I want to ask you a question. Do you want to take that other mic?
Yeah, sure.
Judith, I just have a question because I'm not 100% with you. Do you, in your mind, do you see a difference between, what is the difference between looking at child pornography versus being involved in producing child pornography?
I think it's a very big difference. For a long time, the production of child pornography, which is essentially, let's just stay with what, real pornography, forcing a child to engage in sex against her will and taking pictures of her. That, if it did involve child abuse, it's not just a picture of your kid in the bathtub. It has been illegal for many decades, and I think it should be. Looking at child pornography is like looking at a murder in a movie. It doesn't make you do it. In fact, in the 70s and recently, again, psychologists have started talking about using child pornography as a kind of safety valve for people who might be having fantasies of, say, incest with one of their children. Looking at it as a way of, not doing it. So yes, there's an extremely big difference, but there's no difference in the law.
But isn't buying child pornography to help create a market for the production of child pornography?
Well, that's the argument, and actually, I've always been very skeptical of this argument. I recently read a book that was written in 2001 by a guy named Philip Jenkins, who wrote a very good book called Moral Panic, kind of a classic about moral panics. And he, initially thinking that the child pornography thing was another aspect of the sex panics, went online and began to investigate. He never did look at the images, he just went on these bulletin boards. And he came away, he estimates, he thinks there's 50 to 100,000 people who are looking at child pornography. I think he is unable to parse, which is, are people making things up? Is it the same stuff? Is it old stuff? And he argues that yes, indeed, it does create a market. But, and I think new child pornography is being made. There was just a gigantic bust last summer of a board called Dream Board, in which I think people were actually making extremely cruel child pornographic images. So nevertheless, it's not something that you look at and then you start to want to do. I mean, it's like, recruiting for, gay people. So there is, I think, a small number of people, and just like all sexual subcultures, the internet has made it much more possible for people to get together and trade images and so on. But I think there's a lot of stuff that's just the same stuff over and over and over that was made maybe in the 60s.
Yeah, one more question, and then we'll open up to the audience. I mean, I had sex when I was a minor, and I'm wondering about this, it seems like there's really two different phenomena that are being called the same thing. There's teenagers having sex, and then there's adults coercing or forcing children into sexual. And that are these both seen as equal under the law?
They are seen as equal under the law, in part because under the law, no statutory minor can have sex consensually. The law says that if you have sex under the age of 18 in most states, that you are, even if you do it in some states with another person who's under 18, you must be being coerced because you cannot statutorily give consent. Taking, images of minors having sex. The first law that was passed in 1977, one of the first victims of that law was a book called Show Me. Show Me was a photographic sex ed book that was made first in Germany, came out in English in 1973. And it had explicit pictures of prepubescent children touching each other's bodies and so on. That book became, you can't get it anymore, it's illegal even to possess it. So having sex, this is an interesting thing because, an image of an act I mean, this is the crux, really, of the free speech argument. You know, the act of, say, forcing a child to have sex is child abuse. The image of that is just like the image of somebody murdering somebody. It's not been criminalized, except in this case. It's the only case that the image of an act is illegal.
Okay, let's open it to the audience. People have any comments or questions? Yes.
I just have one question to Ruth about you were talking
Judith.
about this.
Judith?
To Judith, I'm sorry, Judith. This phenomena of, you said anyone who looks at porn is probably winding up with child porn on their hard drive. Can you explain technically how that happens?
No.
Because I have to say, I mean,
I have an answer for that.
there's a case of someone else I know recently, who's accused of the same thing, and in fact is in law enforcement. It was a huge, horrible thing for my family. And he said the same thing. He wound up on my hard drive. I don't know how they got there. I've heard this a number of times, so I'm just curious.
The internet is not necessarily your friend. Anybody who spends any time looking, just, you're bored, you're lonely, whatever, looking at images on the web, you'll inevitably end up places you don't have any interest in going. This shit just like comes at you, and it's there. Your computers record what you've looked at.
Yeah, but I mean, okay, so you haven't actually downloaded the image?
No. I have just one other thing to say is, with viruses which occur, viruses can go into your computer and they can start downloading stuff as well.
Another thing is that there are a lot of websites that have, as you know, if you go to a porn website, they have many sort of links from the site. And there are some that have links to child pornography sites, sort of down, there's a sort of hierarchy. You go to one and that goes to another, goes to another, goes to another. And so when agents, what they'll do is they find a sort of hub site under which somewhere deep below it there may be a child pornography site. And so so what happens is when they do these busts, they'll sometimes round up like 10,000 users, legitimate users of adult porn sites, in order to cull from those people whom they think have gone to these child pornography sites. That's how it happens.
Yes?
So these laws only apply to online computer-oriented situations, or is it print? Is it?
Well, there really isn't any print pornography at all, really. Hardly. What's happened in the child pornography world, it's interesting. It's not a business anymore. It's always a kind of a small business. There was somebody who estimated that kind of the biggest child porn magazine in the 60s had about 30,000 readers. But almost all of it's online, and it's free. People just trade it for free. So it's not a business, and it's pretty much all online. And that's where all the surveillance and enforcement goes on.
And these images were taken from Lawrence's this film you just watched.
No, he's accused of having downloaded actual child pornography, but the FBI also included 100 exhibition prints from this film in their case.
As evidence.
But let me tell you, as far as evidence goes, like sort of if you're a scout leader or a daycare teacher, they use that as evidence against you. If you're a police chief, they use that as, you must have some sort of deep, dark secret. If you have a teddy bear collection. I remember, Holly Hughes has that piece about going to the Supreme Court for the NEA for, and she has a Beanie Baby in her bag, and she's afraid that they're going to stop her as a pedophile. And she says she actually thinks she's sort of a pedophobe. So they'll use what they've got, and if you have pictures of anything or books, it's like communists. If you had, marks on your shelf.
Bill, do you want to say something?
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
These images from this film are categorized as supplemental discovery, there's another word, evidence, thank you. And it's like, it's not that scary until it goes to a trial. a judge has to be very careful in how he rules. But a jury also has to be careful, but a jury can be swayed. And this is the stuff that is used to sway juries. It may not apply necessarily directly to the charge.
So the detention is going to be illegal if he's convicted?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. No.
They're not related.
It probably will not go to trial, and the reason is that even the most inept prosecutor can't lose one of these cases. The deck is so stacked against people that no one goes to trial. This 27-year-old guy, there's just a piece of the paper, got life in prison for looking at child pornography. He had been offered a plea deal of 25 years, which he didn't take, and then instead they gave him life without parole. His lawyer is actually challenging this on the basis of it being a violation of his 8th Amendment right against cruel and unusual punishment, but the courts up through the Supreme Court have found no punishment of a sex offender of any kind, including lifelong registration on the sex offender list as cruel and unusual.
Bill, did you want to say something?
Well, I'm trying to think what to say. I think this is a really important discussion. With these kind of cases, just a simple possession case, the stigma, the shame, and the legal consequences are so great that it's as if the burden of proof is reversed. It's almost like somebody's got to prove that they're innocent. So if you can learn more about this case, or can figure out some way to support Lawrence Brose in particular, do it. I'd also contextualize this in, Nita Bryant, like a lot of these laws date to the late 1970s. And Bryant touched off a panic over children, and I use that word in quotes, and all these years later, think about the Lawrence, the Texas case, where sodomy is supposedly gonna, the overturning of sodomy laws is gonna fix everything. But think carefully about who's hunted down and targeted for sex, and that these laws get tougher and tougher in part because we're silent about them. So there are indeed 750,000 people on sex offender registries that covers a whole range of things, including actual contact cases as well as porn cases. There are very serious residency restrictions in many jurisdictions. There are about 8 states now that have chemical castration as a punishment. There are really long prison sentences. And the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld what I'll call sex gulags, indefinite civil commitment. You can't, it's pretty much like being thrown into the criminal version of a mental hospital without being able to get out. So there's a whole range of things that when someone does something wrong, I think it's really useful for those of us who read about crime and experience, how bad is it? And what do we want done about it? Because sometimes we're willing to use almost nuclear weapons on something that's not very bad. And the right wing has lost so many battles over sex. When somebody crosses age of consent lines, whether just visual material or contact, it's as if they pull out like the most damaging demonical weapons of all because of their pent-up anger that they can't do anything about garden variety homosexuality, swinging, Craigslist, all these things. So what's left is sex work and anything that's underage.
Okay, one last comment, because then we have to get out, yes?
Oh, I just have a question. Can you explain why law was created of looking at the image? How did that actually come about? And also, how do they handle any kind of prosecution if no one can actually tell what these images are?
The second one is a kind of a metaphysical question. But the first one, the theory is that looking at images will make you, that bad thoughts, lead to bad acts. That's the basis of all censorship. And so when there began to be this theory, completely unproven theory really, that if you look at child pornography, you will go out and abuse a child. Or if you look at child pornography, you'll use it to soften up a child for abuse. You show the child the pornography. So in fact, it's even, possession was like a brief interregnum between criminalizing production and criminalizing viewing. The second one, how can they do a prosecution if no one can look at these? The police can look at them. And so now we're all in a situation where we are forced to somehow submit to the opinions of these dirty-minded little two-bit, sheriffs. I mean, that's really who's making decisions about people's lives. Amy Adler, who is an interesting legal scholar, has written about this. One of the criteria for making something, defining something as child porn is if there was lascivious intent by the maker or an intent to inflame the lust of a pedophile. So what Amy says is, we're all in a situation now of looking at every image of a child's body as potentially inflaming the lust of a pedophile and making this judgment, is this pornographic? Which she says, she calls the pedophilic gaze, and she says that we're all now invited, to engage in that gaze. In fact, we sort of have no choice. There is no innocent image of a child, and there is no innocent viewer of an image of a child anymore. And I think that's now hegemonic in the culture. It's rare to see a picture of a child, and I even think without having some sort of anxiety or revulsion looking at it, uh-oh, how did that get there? So, I think this has sunk deeply into the culture. And I want to say one more thing as to what Bill was talking about. The gay community has been hideous about people who are called pedophiles. It has marginalized, NAMBLA. It's sexual McCarthyism. You think I'm a perv? Well, there's a real perv. As if you're going to be, what Gail Rubin talked about, these circles of, marginality, some sort of holding on to being on the inside, get married and so on. And then out there are these real pervs. They are everyone, I have to say. I mean, and even guilty people deserve justice. The sex laws in this country they amount to banishment. Even people who do the worst crimes get to pay their debt and then go on with their lives, except for sex criminals. So I think, people who have themselves been, criminalized for their desires, I actually think there's a responsibility of the gay community to not do that kind of marginalization.
And we will end on that.